Welcome. I'm Dr Omer-Jackaman, Deputy Editor of Fathom. Alongside me, virtually anyway, is Editor Alan Johnson. And we're joined today by Dr Ahron Bregman. Ahron is a Senior Teaching Fellow at King's College London. He served in the Israeli Army for 6 years, taking part in the First Lebanon War and reaching the rank of Major. He's the author, among other books, of Israel's Wars, A History Since 1947, and Elusive Peace, How the Holy Land Defeated America. He was also my first and still my finest teacher on Israel and the Palestinians, and the reason I went into this field, so he has that to live down as well. Ahron, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start, if we can, with the concluding words from an essay you wrote in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas pogrom. You said, quote, "The trauma caused by Hamas's senseless and brutal attack on innocent civilians in southern Israel is likely to remain on the Israeli psyche for at least as long as the Yom Kippur trauma," end quote. Put that into some further context for us, if you would.
Well, the last time that the enemy, the Arabs, invaded Israeli or Jewish settlements and attacked Jews and killed them in their homes was back in 1948. And even then, they were Egyptians, but not Palestinians. Therefore, this is a massive event, and the trauma is felt now in Israel, and it will be felt for many, many years to come, not least because the pictures which are emerging from the Israeli villages, thanks to social media, are horrific. I wouldn't advise anyone to look at these clips and films because it's very traumatic to look at it, even if you do not know the people. And therefore, this trauma is going to be on the Israeli mind for years to come. It will change many things in Israel, I believe, but it will take time, to recover from it.
Sure. I mean, one aspect of the trauma is likely to be the hit to the faith Israelis have in the sort of instruments of state to protect them. You've written about that already. Let's dig into that a little bit. How and why did things go so badly wrong?
There are many aspects to it. There was a failure in the conception, in the system of beliefs in Israel, and from this point of view, it is very similar to 1973. Then in 1973, on the eve of the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis believed in a certain conception, and it's exactly the same case now, and in both cases, they got it wrong. Let's now leave 1973, and what they got wrong in 2023 is the belief, the thought, the conception that they could separate between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And if they help Hamas, for example, by allowing them 20,000 workers to go daily to Israel and work instead of 17,000, then Hamas will accept it and will keep quiet. And then Israel could do things on the West Bank, for example, building settlements, or for some of its ministers to go on Haram el-Sharif, which always provoke the Muslims. And the Israelis believe that would be fine. We would be able to do things on the West Bank but keep Hamas quiet by helping them to survive. And here, the Israelis, we know now, were wrong. And it's not only Netanyahu who believed in it. Leaders before him believed in the same concept, that if you separate them, first of all, the Palestinian movement will fail to achieve the ultimate goal to have a state, but then you could do things in both sides, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and none of them will be annoyed by what's happening on the other side. So this is the big failure, the conception. Then there were tactical mistakes, we can talk about it, but the heart of the matter is the belief that you could give Hamas incentives and it will keep it quiet. That's the heart of the matter. That's a big mistake.
A related question. We've seen quite a few people and some sections of the Israeli public re-arguing or trying to re-legislate disengagement. What's your view?
Can you ask the question again?
So there's quite a few people trying to re-argue the 2005 disengagement, or to pin blame on that decision in the first place, the disengagement plan from Gaza, and to hold that responsible for this. What's your take on that?
Well, the decision made by Ariel Sharon to get out of the Gaza Strip in August, September 2005, always been very controversial, but he decided to do that because he came to the conclusion that you cannot have 8,000 settlers living among, at the time, 1.8 million hostile Palestinians. And therefore came the decision to get out. To go back now to the Gaza Strip will be to live among 2.2 million hostile Palestinians. So it is true that it is more difficult to control an area when you are not physically on the ground, but it was just too difficult to stay on the ground. And therefore, the decision to get out of the Gaza Strip was in many ways was imposed on the Israelis by the reality that it was just too difficult to stay there. Ariel Sharon was a military man. Of course, he was a prime minister at the time, but he was trained as a military man. He understood that from a military point of view, you cannot stay there because you are among too many hostile people.
I mean, we'll return to some of the potential risks with any reoccupation a bit later, but let's come back to failures. Sorry, Alan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to probe a little bit on that. Aaron, I was, like many people, I've been down to the border fence and been given briefings about how secure it is. And I've sat in rooms and watched IDF spotters looking down from the skies and given a sense of the aerial reconnaissance that they have. So I was completely and utterly shocked by what happened at the level of failure. What do you think the implications are of that failure, if there are any, for the likely success or otherwise of a ground operation? Because one of the things that strikes me is that the Hamas operation on October the 7th was on such a scale, involving such numbers, and Israel seemed to know nothing, that it implies that there's no assets, human assets or technical assets to draw on in Gaza at the moment. So they would be going into a Gaza, a dense urban terrain, no doubt prepared by Hamas, with little in the way of intelligence. And I'm a skeptic about the likely results of that. So what's the implications of the failure for the impending invasion?
I want, Alan, if I may, to refer to the beginning of your question, or in short introduction, about the fence. fences, barriers, lines of defense always fail. Always fail. And I remember the day I went to Jerusalem and I interviewed Chaim Bar-Lev. He was the man who was chief of staff, and the line of defense along the Suez Canal was called after him. He was very annoyed with this line of defense because he said to me in the interview for my PhD, this is many years ago, my idea was to have a line of defense along the Suez Canal to provide the soldiers with shelter from daily bombing, but not to stop the enemy. Because he said to me, I don't believe in lines of defense like the Bar-Lev line because they always fall, because there is a psychological dimension here, because people think we have a Bar-Lev line, we have a Maginot line, we have a fence which is 6 meters high and going down to the to the ground, and in their mind people think, oh, we are protected, and therefore we could, for example, remove battalions or soldiers or troops from the area and put them on the West Bank, and therefore, and in the end, you are left with one component of defense, which is the fence, and all the rest are not there. And therefore, tactically, the problem was in 2023 that there was a fence there, which everyone, with cameras, with sensors, you name it, very sophisticated one, but it was supposed to be part of a complex defense system. Yeah. The problem was, and the other components were not there. On the eve of the attack, there were 30 battalions of the West Bank and only 4 battalions in the Gaza Strip area. And therefore, part of the problem was the existence of the fence, because psychologically, it led people to believe we are protected, we are fine. And this is, I think, one of the lessons which the military will try to learn from this unfortunate event. Of course, the Bar-Lev line collapsed very easily in 1973, and this very sophisticated fence collapsed or was pulled down by 2 or 3 old tractors and bulldozers.
I mean, if I can probe that a little more, Aaron. I mean, however this ends up, we're looking at that border being from what you say, being secured in a very different way than it was, say, on October 6th. But at the same time, you've got a current government, some of whose ministers are seeking settlement expansion in the West Bank. How is that circle going to be squared if you without withdrawing those troops from the protection of settlers in the West Bank? How can you reinforce that line?
Well, you bring politics into our discussion. You know, we started with military aspects, defense, lines of defense, etc. Now we are going to talk about politics. The current government got in it elements which believe that settlements should be built on the West Bank, and that Israel should go back to Gaza, that Israel should reoccupy the Gaza Strip. You know, some people in Israel, some, you know, settlers on the West Bank, I don't want to say that they are happy with the events. Nobody is happy with the events, but they long asked to go back to the Gaza Strip. But, you know, battalions or troops were used in recent months to protect settlers who were going to pray in certain place on the West Bank, or to separate between settlers and Palestinians. So politics and military, mixed up, and it led to a situation whereby, with a small military force, the decision was made, given that we have a strong fence, to send them to the West Bank in order to calm down the situation there, which was, very volatile.
We've seen Ronan Barr take responsibility, Defense Minister Gallant take responsibility, despite his address last night, Prime Minister yet really to do so. Where, in your view, does ultimate responsibility lie for what happened? Aside from with Hamas, of course, for whom the gravest responsibility lie, but on the Israeli front, where does the responsibility lie?
I have no doubt whatsoever. I know that George W. Bush used to say that it is difficult to predict, especially the future. So he said, I have no doubt whatsoever that the Chief of Staff will go, the Commander of the Southern Command will go, that the Director of Military Intelligence will go. All these people will go. I think the head of the Shabak, of the Israeli MI5, will also go. They will go because they failed enormously. They failed twice. Number one, they failed to predict that it's coming. Number two, when it did come, it took them 4 or 5 hours to organize themselves and to come protect the Israelis. Hamas just, stayed in the villages for hours, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours. Where was the military? My mother phoned me. She lives, in a place called Rehovot. And she said to me, where is the military? Where are the soldiers? There were nowhere to be found. And therefore, the military will go. As for the politicians, I don't know. I don't know. Of course, Netanyahu, as the head of Prime Minister, is responsible for the terrible events, not least because before the before 10th of October, and for months, he tried to do things which weakened Israeli society, which divided Israeli society, and is part of the reason why there was an attack, because he tried, as I'm sure you know, to promote a judicial change to which there was very strong opposition in Israel. And there were people who said, oh, okay, we are not going to serve in the military. And the enemies probably read it, well, there's an opportunity now. The society is not strong enough. We can attack them now. And military commanders, including the Minister of Defense, warned that it was a dangerous moment to Israel because the enemy is looking and seeing a vulnerable society. I'm sure that you know that the Prime Minister dismissed his defense minister because the defense minister warned against something which was which could happen, and then he brought him back. So to cut long story short, I believe that the military will go, just like in 1973, because they're honor people and they understand. You don't have to tell them. They understand that they failed enormously. Let's leave the surprise. But to take so many hours to come and protect the people, this is number one priority to protect the people. I'm not talking about protecting the state now, protecting the people. This is a terrible failure. They will all go. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Aaron, can I ask you why you think there was such a long delay before the response came? Because whenever I've spoken to anyone in the IDF, they've quite rightly prided themselves on the fact that they're not like other militaries in the sense of hidebound, hierarchical, where the decisions can only be taken at the top. They've always talked about the initiative, a critical sense being a culture throughout. I've also traveled those distances and I know how short they are. It's just beyond my comprehension why it was that hours passed by before significant forces weren't sent down. I mean, do you have any answer to that?
I think that I know, but it will, of course, be investigated. I think that when they were called to come and help, they never imagined that something like that is happening. In other words, that if a Hamas falls, the size of a brigade, for God's sake, a brigade, 3, 4 battalions, we are talking about at least 1,500 people. There were 2 waves. There were the Hamas, I don't know how to call them, fighters, terrorists, I always prefer to call them combatants, because if you call them terrorists, they are not taken seriously enough. So whatever we call them, I think that those who are supposed to respond, to come and help, never realized how big it is. They thought, okay, 3, 4 terrorists cross the border and we have an incident. We don't have to go with a brigade or with 2 brigades to respond. This, I think, is the heart of the matter. The failure to realize how big it is. They were caught off guard, the Israelis. But it will have to be investigated, and it took them too long. Yeah.
Let's leave the recent past and look at the present and an expected future. It seems that same military echelon that you've just been talking about is increasingly frustrated that it hasn't yet been given the order for a ground incursion into Gaza. Is that your understanding? And what are your understandings of the reasons for the delay? Is it US pressure? Is it Bibi's indecisiveness? Your old friend Ehud Barak saying of him that there's not enough sabra in Bibi, that he can be indecisive when it comes to moments like this. Is this what we're looking at, or what's your read?
I'm happy that Netanyahu is undecisive. He likes to compare himself to Churchill. I would compare him to Levi Eshkol, the Prime Minister of Israel in 1960. Some aspects, they are very different, but in that he hesitates. It's very good news. It's very, very good news. I want him to hesitate before ordering the Israeli troops to enter the Gaza Strip. Let's take it one by one. The delay is for a variety of reasons. First of all, there are the hostages. There are about 200 Israeli, not all of them are Israeli. There are 200 hostages taken from Israel. They are in the Gaza Strip. And there is pressure on the Israeli government, public pressure in Israel proper, to release them and to do it before a military operation, because the moment you start with a military operation, on the one hand, you have more intelligence, you can maybe find them. On the other hand, they could be killed. So there is this hostages matter. And when it all started, I listened very carefully to Netanyahu and others. He said, we are going in, we are going to do that. And the aim was to topple Hamas. Too ambitious, by the way, we could come to it later, but the aim was to topple Hamas and not to do anything about the hostages. When he appeared on television the other day, all of a sudden there are two objectives: toppling Hamas and hostages. You cannot do these two things together. You have to do one first and then the other. You can say, okay, I'm going to invade now. It means that there will be no negotiations about the hostages. You'll have to do it after the war, if they're still alive. Or you can decide, as Prime Minister, I'm going to do hostages, and then I'll go and do war. It can't work. You can't do the two together. You can't. You just technically, you cannot. So the hostages is a big matter now. And my impression is that they're trying to focus on it at the moment. And the Hamas, they are playing their cards very well. Very well. Because they are releasing 2 or 3. And if they say, the moment Hamas stops saying, let's talk about hostages, there will be a ground operation. As long as they say, oh, let's talk tonight about hostages, the Israelis, in my view, will not go in. That's the situation. So the matter about the hostages, the Americans are very involved. They are very involved. They are sitting in the cabinet. They are looking into the military plans. And they do it from a variety of reasons. They understand that the Israelis want to topple Hamas, but they do not want Israel to shake up the Middle East. They don't want a big war with Hezbollah, with Iran, with Syria, etc. They want it local. And therefore, they keep an eye on the Israelis. They keep an eye on the Israelis, and they check the plans. Also, we have to remember, also they are warning the Israelis. Be careful, because they have, of course, the experience of the Iraq War. In 2003, the Americans invaded Iraq. And they went to places like Mosul and Fallujah. And if you take Mosul, for example, in terms of geography, numbers of people, it's very similar to Gaza. Very similar to Gaza. So the Americans said to the Israelis, look, it's urban battle. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be complicated. And they are warning the Israelis. And I can see the hesitation on the Israeli side. I can see it. Are we going to do it? And there are two schools of thought now I can see emerging. They're not spelling it out, but I can see it. One, a school of thought say we have to get in and do the job. The other school of thought say we shouldn't do that. We should do it from the air and then do operations here and there. Having said that, sorry, I'm a bit long. I'll stop in a minute. Having said that, Israel cannot topple Hamas, which is not a good idea in my view. We can talk about it militarily. They cannot topple them without getting in. If they want, if this is the aim, if this is the objective, you must invade. You have to find them. You have to kill them. And the objective is still there, to topple Hamas, which scares me, I must say, because the implication is an invasion. So just to summarize it, the Americans are looking into the plan. The Americans want to deploy themselves, their forces, because they are attacked in Iraq, for example. They have to deploy, they have to be ready, because the moment Israel moves in, it could trigger a big war. So the Americans want time to deploy. The Americans want the Israelis to be careful, and there is the issue with the hostages. These are the reasons for the current delay. If the issue, one last word, if the issue of the hostages get stuck, there will be no reason for the Israelis, or there will be nothing to hold them back. And then they will probably act.
Let's go to something you mentioned just then, Aaron. You say that toppling Hamas as a mission objective concerns you. Why, and what should the mission objective be instead?
It's a crazy idea. How can you topple Hamas? Because, first of all, there are 40,000 Hamas combatants. Okay, they are not terrorists in Gaza. They are maybe terrorists in Israel. I'm very careful with the use of these terms. I know how loaded they are. There are 40,000 of them in the Gaza Strip. The average, and I know that it's not going to, you're not going to like it. The average Hamas fighter combatant in the Gaza Strip is as good, if not better, than the average Israeli reservist. Yeah, they are better trained. They know the terrain. They are ready in defense. Therefore, if the Israelis are going to go in, it will be very bloody. Both sides. And we have to remember that Israel starts it with a deficit, and it's not nice to say it in this way, deficit of 1,400 people. They've already lost 1,400. Numbers matter. And therefore, there's going to be a big opposition there. And the very successful Hamas attack, and I'm talking about the surprise, how they moved in, not about, God forbid, the terrible massacre, which is the highest in the evil scale. I'm not talking about that. But militarily, if you analyze it in a cool way, the surprise that they inflicted on Israel, catching them off guard, and the movement into the villages, the way they organized themselves, it was well planned. And it's an indication for the Israelis and a warning to the Israelis that the defense is probably going to be as good as the attack. Again, don't get me wrong. I, God forbid, not endorse the terrible massacre. I want it to be very clear. But militarily, the invasion into Israel was very successful from Hamas' point of view. And it should be a warning to the Israelis that defense could be as good as the attack. Therefore, it's going to be tough moving into the area and trying to topple Hamas. You can say after 9 months, say, of operation, we finish them, we toppled Hamas, and then one Palestinian will throw a missile at you and say, here we are, you didn't topple me, I'm still existed. Physically it is difficult to do that, but there is something which is bigger than that. The Gaza Strip is small, 350 square kilometers. But there are 2.2 million people there. 67% of them under the age of 30. 70% of them depend on international aid. It's a terrible place and hostile place. And to operate militarily in such an environment, even if you ask them to go to the south, is very difficult. It's very difficult, it's very crowded, and they are very hostile. We have to remember that these people, these young people, were born probably around 2000. They were educated or indoctrinated, if you want, by Hamas. And therefore, to operate within such an environment is very difficult. And the world, the United Nations, even the Americans, the British, at some point will say to the Israelis, just stop. And therefore, it is a bridge too far to say we are going to topple Hamas. And one last word, the Israelis cannot afford another failure, because it will really ruin what remains of their deterrence. So if all of a sudden they go into the Gaza Strip, they're bogged down and there are many killed and it's not successful, the enemies around will say, maybe it's an opportunity for us. I get out of bed every morning and I pray that the Israelis will not go in. The Israeli military is not ready for that. They spent recent years doing police duties. They are not trained to do something as big as that. And therefore, to go to the beginning of my long rambling speech, I'm happy that Netanyahu hesitates, because I think that it's not a good idea to do it the way they want to do it. They have to look to do it different way, maybe, but not take the chances, because it would be bloody and they could just lose what remains of their deterrence.
But just to push you a little bit on that, Aaron, what would be an alternative way of restoring Israeli deterrence in a more minimal way, if you like? What's a more realistic mission objective?
My preference, and I think that many Americans with the experience of Mosul and Fallujah, I know what happened in Mosul very well, because I'm teaching about these fights and Fallujah, etc. And I know that it's going, if the Israelis are going this way, big invasion, it could take at least, my estimate, 6 to 9 months to establish themselves, and even then they will fail to achieve their achievements. And therefore, I would say, do it from the air as you're doing it now, and do operations here and there. Go in and get out. And try to look, the tasks of the Israeli government now are huge. They have to rebuild Israel in many ways. Rebuild the Israeli society after what happened in the south and in Israel before. The tasks are enormous. And therefore, do it, finish with it, but have another round you've done before. But don't declare things which you'll find very difficult to achieve. When the 2006 war started, the Prime Minister said, we are not going to stop the war until we got back the soldiers who were abducted. He never achieved the same. 2006. And therefore, to say we are going to topple Hamas is too ambitious. And Hamas is not only military forces, it's also an idea. Especially in the Gaza Strip. So I would say, and I pray for it, do something limited. Don't be too ambitious. Just get it out of the way and rebuild what you have to rebuild now, which is Israeli society.
Aaron, I pray with you every morning. And in part, that's because I opposed the Iraq war, but I worked with the Iraqi trade unions in the aftermath. And that involved meetings with people in Number 10 and going over to lobby in Congress and meeting DOD people and so on. And what I found was you will never find a politician or a military person who'll say, I can't deliver that. There was this constant peppy, can-do attitude, which I can kind of understand. You're going to go into battle. But it meant that constantly people weren't taking realistic views of the actual situation on the ground. there's a kind of Panglossian kind of, optimism about it all. And the dynamic to me seems to be Israel has a containment paradigm, but since October the 7th, the attitude seems to be that paradigm has to go because there is no alternative, and we need a new paradigm which will involve us in a ground invasion. To me, what seems to be missing from that is any sense of any realistic calculation about what will happen when they go in, which you've been laying out. I don't hear any kind of a plan for how and who will run Gaza after such an invasion. And the potential for a worsening of the situation seems to be discounted in advance. So the potential of a regional conflict which involves Hezbollah and Lebanon in the north, the West Bank going up in flames, Israel getting stuck in Gaza, the international community throwing their hands up in horror at the death toll. I don't really get a sense of a realistic, prudential discussion taking place about what could go wrong here. I get a sense of something that reminds me very much of what I saw reasonably close up with Iraq.
My impression is that the Americans realize that the Israelis are in a revenge mode at the moment. The Americans realize it. And they try to calm things down. This is my impression from the visits to Israel. The fact that the Secretary of State is sitting in the cabinet meetings of the Israeli government, or that there are 2 American generals in Israel, not meeting with the chief of staff, but talking to the soldiers on the ground. And my impression is that the Americans are trying to calm down the situation for the Israelis, so they will work thinking and not, doing it. They're not being in a revenge mode, which is not a good idea. What the Americans are trying also to, sorry, I divert now from your point. What the Americans also trying to do is to try and convince the Israelis that they must think about the end game.
Yeah.
About the end game. What's going to happen the day after? What do you want to achieve? It's just not about, killing people or toppling Hamas. What next? The next is, I can keep listening to Biden. He said negotiations. 2-state solution, that's fantastic, good idea. But it's not clear yet what's in between the invasion and the real end game. I can see, what could happen, I can try to predict. I can see 3 or 4 options. But again, to go to the main point, I think, and it calmed me down, I can see that the Americans are there for their own interests too. They don't want to be war. And they calm things down, and they restrain the Israel. This is my impression. I might be wrong, but I can see all the people, visiting Israel and their involvement and their statements in Washington later. I am not sure that I answered your question, Alan, but yeah.
Let's have one last question out, and I suspect we're all going to be united on our criticism of current thinking again. Alan and I wrote last week against the policy of total siege against the Gaza Strip, that it's wrong on both moral and pragmatic diplomatic grounds. What's your take?
Oh yeah, it is very wrong. And anyway, the Americans stopped it. There is no siege. There is limitation and restriction on the amount of things getting into Gaza. And of course, it's not enough. They need at least 100 trucks a day. And what they get now is about 30, and they don't get fuel because the Israelis, for obvious reasons. but the principle of siege is not there. The Americans stopped it because you can see trucks coming into the Gaza Strip, and I can compare it, to the siege of Beirut, in which I was involved in the 1982 war, where nothing got in. Nothing got in. I remember I was in, there was a siege in July, August 1982 on Beirut. Beirut was shut off. Nothing. So there is no siege at the moment. There is not enough food and water, etc., going into the Gaza Strip. The Israelis are trying to put pressure because of the hostages. They hope that they will release them. So no siege, I think. There are things coming and going, again, not enough.